The skies over Valen Prime were never quiet. They shimmered continuously with vibrant ether veins, thick atmospheric rivers of dense, glowing energy that painted the clouds in shifting violet and copper hues. Beneath this radiant canopy, 3 young Valen siblings navigated the rolling blue sand dunes near their homestead, searching for fallen skydust crystals to bring back to their mother's metalworking shop. Vale, the eldest at 10 years old, led the way with cautious, measured steps, his tall and remarkably lean frame carrying the faint blue luminescence typical of their species. Behind him, 9-year-old Zora bounced eagerly across the crests, using tiny, effortless bursts of her natural energy to hover a few inches off the ground and avoid the heavy dust entirely. 6-year-old Nox brought up the rear, his large, dark eyes constantly scanning the horizon for anything unusual. Nox stopped suddenly at the ridge of a high dune, pointing toward a jagged basalt formation in the distance. A thin, sputtering trail of dark smoke was rising from a shallow crater, twisting into the violet air like a smudge of charcoal. Vale immediately held out a long, slender arm to shield his siblings, his bioluminescent skin dimming slightly in caution as he instructed them to stay close behind him. Approaching the edge of the impact zone with careful precision, they peered over the rocks to find a small, metallic capsule half buried in the crushed sand. It was dented, scorched from atmospheric entry, and completely cold to the touch. Its markings were entirely foreign, sharp and blocky, carrying none of the fluid, curved script characteristic of Valen technology. Zora hovered closer to the metallic shell, her skin dimming in nervousness as she whispered her concern about whether the metallic object could be a forgotten weapon from off-world traders. Before Vale could pull her back to safety, a faint, rustling sound echoed from the far side of the crater, drawing their attention to a small bundle lying in the shadow of a basalt boulder. It had been thrown clear of the impact and sat wrapped in a dense, heavy gray synthetic fabric that looked entirely out of place against the shimmering blue dust. Nox stepped forward despite Vale's stern warning, drawn by a soft, rhythmic movement underneath the folds of the heavy material. Kneeling down into the soft sand, the youngest brother carefully reached out with his long fingers and pulled back the topmost fold of the strange gray cloth. Inside the bundle lay a living infant, though it looked like nothing any of the children had ever seen before. It lacked the smooth, radiant skin, crystalline skull ridges, and extra limbs of a proper Valen child, possessing instead a small, round head covered in short dark hair, pale skin, and tiny, rounded ears. It had only 2 soft arms, completely devoid of any bioluminescent markings or energy channels beneath the surface. As the cold alien wind swept over the lip of the crater, the tiny creature squirmed against the sudden drop in temperature and let out a fragile, shuddering cry that echoed strangely across the silent dunes. Nox gasped quietly, marveling at how soft and warm the creature felt, and extended a single long finger toward its face. To his utter shock, the baby's tiny hand snapped shut around his finger, holding on with a sudden, surprising tightness that made the young Valen giggle. Vale knelt beside his brother, his analytical eyes scanning the infant's strange physiology with a mixture of awe and profound concern. He pointed out that the creature had no energy field at all, making it look as fragile as a piece of spun glass under the crushing weight of Valen Prime's sky. Zora hovered down to join them, her curiosity overcoming her fear as she watched the small alien child open its eyes, revealing wide, dark brown pupils that stared up at the glowing sky without understanding. Realizing that the baby would quickly freeze in the open desert or succumb to the planet's harsh atmosphere, Vale wrapped his long arms around the bundle, lifting the unexpectedly heavy child into his chest. He looked at his younger brother and sister, declaring firmly that they could not leave the child in the sand, but needed to carry it directly back to their mother before anyone else in the territory noticed the fallen capsule. The journey back across the dunes was slow and quiet, with all 3 siblings taking turns shielding the fragile bundle from the rising winds. As they reached the stone threshold of their homestead, Vale pushed open the heavy wooden doors, calling out for their mother as they rushed inside to escape the gathering storm outside. Kalia sat at her central forge, carefully shaping an energy-dense piece of metal with her glowing palms, but she immediately set her tools aside at the sound of panic in her children's voices. When she stepped down from the hearth and looked into the gray bundle held tightly in Vale's arms, her glowing skin paled in absolute shock. She gently reached out to take the infant, feeling the incredible, dense weight of its small body under the heavy gravity of their home planet. Looking up at her 3 eager children, Kalia demanded to know where they had found such a creature, listening intently as Vale quickly explained the scorched capsule in the basalt dunes. She cradled the baby close to her chest, noticing how its breathing smoothed out against the warmth of her body, though her mind raced with the terrifying reality of their situation. Valen Prime operated under strict planetary isolation laws, meaning any foreign life form or off-world crash would be immediately confiscated by the regional authorities, forcing the child into a cold, sterile sanctuary for study. Kalia looked down into the infant's wide brown eyes, feeling a strong, maternal instinct surge through her as the child reached out a tiny hand to touch the warm, blue glow of her cheek. She turned back to her children, her voice dropping into a solemn, decisive whisper as she told them that if they alerted the local wardens, the fragile child would spend its entire life behind glass walls, surrounded by strangers who viewed it only as a curiosity. She looked at Vale, Zora, and Nox, reminding them that the stars had delivered this child directly to their doorstep, making it their responsibility to protect him from the harsh realities of the universe. The 3 siblings nodded in unison, their decision made without a single word of hesitation. Kalia smiled softly through her worry, wrapping the heavy gray cloth securely around the infant once more, and announced to her family that they would name the boy Leo, after the ancient Valen constellation that represented unbreakable endurance against the storm. The early days of raising Leo inside the homestead were an intense, daily lesson in foreign biology that tested Kalia's resourcefulness to its absolute limits. While young Valen infants naturally absorbed ambient atmospheric energy and required only light nutrient fluids to thrive, Leo possessed a digestive system that completely rejected the native, energy-dense nursery milk. Kalia spent long, exhausting nights in her workshop, grinding deep-root vegetables and synthesizing rich mineral pastes to create a formula that could support human bone development under the planet's immense gravitational pull. The heavy gravity of Valen Prime, nearly 1.5 times stronger than Earth's standard force, proved to be an immediate and overwhelming obstacle for the human infant. While his adoptive siblings slid gracefully across the polished stone floors and hovered effortlessly as toddlers, little Leo lay on his blanket, struggling with all his strength just to lift his heavy head off the ground. By the time Leo reached his 4th year, the sheer physical contrast between him and his alien family became an inescapable reality of daily life. Valen children were built like delicate reeds, long-limbed and filled with natural buoyancy that allowed them to ride the atmospheric currents with effortless grace. Leo, on the other hand, was growing into a stout, solid child with broad shoulders and dense, heavy limbs that felt pulled down by invisible lead weights. On a clear morning, Zora stood perched at the very edge of the tall stone courtyard wall, balancing on one slender foot while laughing as she let the warm wind lift her several feet into the air. She looked down at Leo, who was sitting in the blue dirt at the base of the wall, drenched in sweat from trying and failing to haul himself up the wooden training ladder. Zora called down to her little brother with playful impatience, urging him to just jump into the air and let the atmospheric currents catch him like she did. Leo wiped the sweat from his eyes, gritted his teeth, and bent his knees deeply, trying with all his physical might to spring off the hard ground. He managed to clear barely 2 feet of height before gravity pulled him back down, slamming his boots hard into the stone patio with a loud, resounding thud that rattled his teeth. He fell back onto his hands and knees, scraping his skin on the sharp rock, but he refused to let out a single cry of frustration. Instead, he simply reached up, grabbed the lowest rung of the wooden ladder with a firm, white-knuckled grip, and began hauling his heavy body up step by painful step. Vale, who was leaning against the stone pillar while quietly weaving small threads of blue light between his fingertips, walked over to the wall and scolded Zora gently for giving Leo impossible expectations. He reminded his sister that Leo did not possess an energy field, meaning the sky would never hold him up the way it held them up. Kalia stepped out from the hearth room, holding 2 heavy iron workout bars she had forged specifically for her youngest son, and sat down beside Leo as he finally reached the top of the wall, panting heavily. She wiped the dust from his forehead with a soft cloth, looking deeply into his dark brown eyes, and told him that he should never waste his energy trying to fly like the wind when his true gift was the earth itself. She explained to the boy that while his brother and sister were like feathers riding the storm, he was meant to be the mountain that the storm could never move. Kalia handed him the 2 heavy iron bars, watching closely as Leo took them into his hands, his small fingers wrapping completely around the solid metal. Instead of collapsing under the added weight, Leo set his jaw, planted his bare feet firmly into the dirt, and stood straight up, his young legs trembling slightly under the tremendous strain before locking solidly into place. Kalia smiled warmly, realizing that while the crushing gravity of their planet would have broken an ordinary human, Leo's body was slowly adapting by compressing his muscles and thickening his bones into something extraordinarily dense and resilient. Over the next few years, Leo's daily training routine diverged entirely from the light, airy lessons given to Vale, Zora, and Nox. While the 3 Valen children sat in quiet meditation under the outdoor arbor, learning to refine their levitation and stretch their bioluminescent fields into the upper air, Leo spent his afternoons carrying heavy sacks of basalt stone up the steep slopes of the Blue Dunes. Nox would often walk beside him, offering quiet encouragement and carrying a skin of cool water to splash over Leo's overheated face when the suns reached their peak. Nox would watch in quiet fascination as his brother's body moved, noting how Leo's heart beat with a slow, powerful thud that sounded like a heavy hammer striking an anvil inside his chest. One afternoon, as the children rested in the shadow of a large rock formation after a long day of physical work, Zora threw a small wooden training sphere toward Leo's head to test his reaction speed. Leo didn't flinch or dodge out of the way. Instead, he simply brought his forearm up in a quick, instinctual arc, striking the hard wooden sphere with incredible force. The sphere exploded into a cloud of splinters upon hitting his solid forearm, while Leo merely shook out his hand, completely unbothered by the impact. Zora gasped, floating down to touch his arm in disbelief, remarking that his skin felt less like soft flesh and more like cured leather stretched over solid iron. Leo looked at his thick, calloused hands, comparing them to the long, glowing fingers of his brother and sister, feeling a sudden wave of self-consciousness about how drastically different he was from everyone he loved. He asked Nox quietly if it bothered him that he had a brother who couldn't float, couldn't glow in the dark, and looked like a heavy lump of stone next to graceful dancers. Nox wrapped his long arm around Leo's broad shoulders, pulling him close, and told him firmly that a house built on high pillars needed strong foundations more than it needed extra windows. He assured Leo that while they could light up the dark, he was the anchor that kept all of them grounded when the heavy winds blew across the plains. As the suns began to set, painting the sky in deep shades of crimson and violet, the 4 children began their slow trek back toward the warm glow of the homestead. Leo carried the heavy iron weights slung across his shoulders, his boots leaving deep, firm tracks in the blue sand with every confident step he took. He looked up at the shimmering ether veins overhead, no longer wishing he could fly up into them, but realizing that his strength came from fighting the very ground beneath his feet. Inside the house, Kalia stood at the door watching them return, her heart swelling with pride as she saw her strange, earthbound son walking tall among the stars, completely unbroken by the weight of the world she had chosen to raise him on. As Leo approached his 9th year, the atmospheric energy of Valen Prime reached a seasonal crest, flooding the sky with thick, pulsing rivers of raw power. For Valen youth, this period marked the beginning of energy manifestation, a rite of passage where their crystalline nervous systems began to interface with the ambient ether veins. In the center of the family courtyard, Vale and Zora sat cross-legged on polished stone pedestals, practicing their casting under Kalia's watchful eye. Vale held his palms open, summoning a spinning orb of deep indigo flame that hovered effortlessly between his hands, casting a cool glow across his face. Beside him, Zora let out a delighted laugh as she manipulated the energy around 3 heavy gravel stones, sending them dancing through the air in a synchronized, rotating ring. Leo sat in the middle of the dust nearby, his broad shoulders hunched as he tried for the 100th time to copy his siblings' movements. He closed his eyes, held out his thick hands, and tried to summon even the smallest spark of light from the surrounding air. He squeezed his eyes shut, concentrating until his temples throbbed and his breath came in heavy, ragged gasps, but his hands remained dark, rough, and entirely devoid of magic. Opening his eyes, he looked down at his empty palms, feeling the familiar, heavy knot of frustration tightening in his chest as he realized that no matter how hard he tried, there was no crystalline grid beneath his skin to channel the world's energy. Nox stepped down from his own pedestal, walking over to sit cross-legged in the sand directly opposite his brother. The younger Valen reached out and gently placed his slender, glowing hands over Leo's calloused wrists, telling him softly to stop trying to force the light outward like a torch. Nox explained that Leo was trying to speak a language his body wasn't built to speak, urging him instead to close his eyes and simply listen to the quiet, heavy pulse vibrating through the ground beneath them. Leo took a deep breath, letting his shoulders drop, and listened into the silence, focusing not on the sky above, but on the rhythmic, heavy thrum of energy circulating through the very air he breathed into his lungs. For months, while his siblings perfected their long-range energy bolts and light shields, Leo's daily training transformed into an entirely internal discipline. Kalia recognized early on that while human physiology could not project energy outward into space, the high-density atmosphere of Valen Prime was constantly being drawn into Leo's expanding lungs. Furthermore, years of resisting the crushing gravity had turned his muscular and skeletal systems into an extraordinarily dense biological sponge. Rather than bouncing off him, the ambient thermal and kinetic energy in the environment was being steadily absorbed into his dense muscle fibers and stored directly within his nervous system, waiting for a physical outlet to unleash it. The true breakthrough came during an unexpected afternoon storm, when a localized energy squall tore across the valley, rattling the heavy slate roof of Kalia's workshop. A massive support beam made of iron-hard timber snapped under the violent pressure of a sudden wind gust, swinging loose from the rafters directly toward where Nox was sitting at his workbench. Zora gasped, instinctively throwing out her hands to fire a kinetic blast at the beam, but her light magic was too weak to alter the course of such a heavy mass. Vale scrambled across the floor to pull Nox out of the way, but the falling timber was moving far too quickly, threatening to crush the youngest sibling beneath its immense weight. Leo didn't attempt to cast a spell, nor did he look for an energy shield to project through the air. Fueled by pure instinct, he moved with a sudden, terrifying speed that blurred his form across the stone workshop floor. Drawing upon the atmospheric charge his body had absorbed throughout the stormy afternoon, his heavy muscles converted the stored energy directly into explosive physical momentum. He planted his boots into the stone, drove his broad shoulders beneath the falling iron timber, and caught the full, crushing weight of the beam in his bare hands just inches above Nox's head. The force of the sudden impact released a loud, thunderous crack that shook the foundation of the house, sending spiderweb fractures across the stone floor beneath Leo's feet. Yet, despite the immense weight crashing down on him, Leo's dense frame did not buckle or yield an inch. His skin, usually pale and earthly, briefly flared with a bright, iridescent golden sheen as his body absorbed the kinetic energy of the collision, converting the dangerous force into raw physical power that locked his muscles like solid steel. He stood motionless, holding the multi-ton beam high above his head with his bare hands, his breathing heavy but completely steady. Nox scrambled back from beneath the shadow of the timber, staring up at his brother in absolute wonder as Leo slowly, deliberately heaved his shoulders upward. With a deep, guttural roar, Leo tossed the massive beam away from his family, sending it crashing harmlessly onto the empty stone patio outside, where it shattered into fragments. Silence instantly descended upon the workshop, broken only by the whistling wind of the storm outside and the heavy thud of Leo's heart beating against his chest. Zora lowered her hands in shock, looking back and forth between the cracked floorboards and her brother, declaring in disbelief that he had just caught a falling mountain without using a single drop of magic. Kalia walked over to her son, her glowing blue hands trembling slightly as she gently took hold of his broad, calloused fingers, feeling the intense heat still radiating from his skin. She looked into his eyes, smiling with profound pride, and explained to him that while his brother and sister were casters who shaped the energy outside of themselves, he was a living forge that absorbed the world into his very bones. She reassured him that he was never lacking in magic, but was simply built to embody it, turning the strength of the planet into an unstoppable force that protected the people he loved. Leo looked down at his palms, which were still humming with a faint, warm vibration from the energy he had just absorbed, feeling the lingering frustration of the past few years completely melt away. He looked at Nox, who was picking himself up from the floor with a relieved smile, and then at Vale and Zora, who were staring at him not with pity, but with newfound respect. For the first time in his life, Leo realized that being different from his family didn't make him weaker or lesser than them. He didn't need to fly among the clouds or cast light into the dark to belong, because he had found his true place as the immovable pillar holding up their home. By his 12th year, Leo's daily routine had transformed into a refined system of mutual training that tested both his physical limits and his siblings' energy mastery. In the wide, rocky clearing behind their home, the 4 children spent their afternoons in structured combat exercises designed to sharpen their unique abilities. Vale and Zora stood at opposite ends of the clearing, firing rapid, crackling bolts of compressed ether toward their brother to help him practice his energy absorption. Leo stood his ground in the center of the field, his short, heavily muscular frame absorbing the plasma like impacts directly into his chest and arms. Instead of burning or bruising him, each glowing strike sent tiny ripples of iridescent light across his skin, feeding his muscle fibers with kinetic energy that made him faster and stronger by the second. Zora stopped her barrage for a moment, wiping a strand of silver hair from her glowing face as she called out to Leo, warning him that she was about to double the speed of her kinetic projectiles. Leo wiped the sweat from his chin, cracked his broad knuckles with a resounding snap, and flashed her a confident grin, telling her to stop holding back and hit him with everything she had. Zora laughed, raising both palms to channel a whirling vortex of violet wind that hurled 3 boulder-sized rocks directly at his head in rapid succession. Leo didn't dodge or shield himself. He charged straight forward, his boots shattering the ground with every explosive stride as he smashed the incoming boulders to dust with 3 quick, devastating fist strikes. Watching from the edge of the field, Vale called a temporary halt to the drill, stepping forward to examine the deep, fractured craters Leo's boots were leaving in the hard basalt ground. Vale shook his head in marveling disbelief, remarking to Nox that their brother's physical density had surpassed anything recorded in local Valen anatomical texts. He pointed out that while a standard Valen's energy output peaked when casting outward, Leo's physical power grew exponentially the more kinetic force he absorbed, turning every enemy attack into raw fuel for his own body. Nox smiled warmly, adding that Leo was no longer just adapting to their world's heavy gravity, but was actively bending the planet's physical laws to suit his human frame. Later that evening, inside Kalia's bustling workshop, Leo sat beside his adoptive mother at the central metalworking bench, helping her hammer out heavy sheets of energy-conductive iron. While Kalia used her bioluminescent palms to soften the dense metal with heat, Leo used his massive physical strength to shape the glowing plates with a heavy steel hammer. As the rhythm of their clanging work slowed, Leo looked down at his reflection in a polished metal sheet, noticing how his shoulders had broadened to nearly twice the width of Vale's, and how his dark eyes carried a subtle, golden shimmer whenever he worked with active energy. He asked Kalia quietly if she ever worried about what would happen if the regional wardens discovered what he truly was. Kalia paused her work, setting her glowing hands down on the cool stone table as she looked at her youngest son with deep, tender affection. She reminded him that 16 years had passed since his capsule fell from the sky, and that in all that time, no warden or investigator had ever set foot near their isolated homestead. She admitted that while his presence would shock the local authorities, he was no longer a defenseless alien infant hidden in a gray swaddle, but a young man fully capable of standing his ground against any threat in the galaxy. She placed her warm palm against his thick shoulder, assuring him that as long as they remained united as a family, no laws or isolation protocols could ever tear him away from his home. As the suns dipped beneath the horizon, casting deep indigo shadows across the workshop walls, Nox rushed through the stone doors with an urgent expression on his face. He called for Leo and Kalia to come outside immediately, reporting that a massive, wild canyon strider, a fierce, long-limbed predatory beast native to the high ridges, had broken through the perimeter fence near the family's water reservoir. The creature, crazed by the heavy seasonal ether storms, was violently thrashing against the main aqueduct pipes, threatening to shatter the homestead's vital water supply. Vale and Zora were already at the site, using their light shields to keep the beast at bay, but the creature's dense hide was deflecting their energy attacks with ease. Leo didn't hesitate for a single second. He grabbed his heavy iron-reinforced chest plate, buckled it across his torso, and sprinted toward the reservoir at blinding speed. As he crested the hill, he saw the massive strider rearing back on its 4 powerful hind legs, its crystalline claws glowing with wild, unchanneled electrical energy as it prepared to smash through Vale's weakened force field. Zora fired 2 bright plasma bolts at its flanks, but the beast barely flinched, snapping its heavy jaws toward her with terrifying speed. Realizing his siblings were running out of energy to hold the perimeter, Leo let out a fierce, ringing battle cry that echoed off the canyon walls, drawing the monster's full attention directly toward himself. The canyon strider spun around, roaring in fury as it charged down the slope straight at the lone human, its heavy claws sweeping forward in a devastating strike meant to tear him apart. Leo didn't attempt to run or weave out of the path of the beast's lunging attack. Instead, he planted his feet deep into the blue soil, locked his broad shoulders, and raised his thick forearms to catch the monster's razor-sharp claws in midair. The massive impact released a blinding shockwave of compressed air and kinetic force, tearing up the surrounding turf for 20 feet in every direction. But Leo held his ground like an iron pillar anchored to the core of the world. As the beast struggled in vain to push him back, the electrical energy surging through its claws flowed directly into Leo's arms, causing his skin to blaze with a dazzling, brilliant golden light. Leo absorbed the creature's wild power, converting the high-voltage energy into raw, overwhelming muscle strength that made his grip on the monster's claws completely unshakable. Looking the towering predator dead in its glowing eyes, Leo gave a powerful heave, twisting his body with immense leverage and slamming the massive canyon strider onto its side in the dirt. The beast let out a stunned, breathless grunt as it hit the ground, completely subdued by the sheer, unyielding force of the human standing over it. Vale and Zora rushed over to their brother's side, their eyes wide with excitement as Leo stepped back, allowing the dazed creature to scramble to its feet and retreat back into the safety of the distant ridges. Nox slapped Leo hard on his broad back, cheering loudly as Leo's golden glow slowly faded back into his normal, healthy complexion. Leo panted lightly, wiping the dust from his forehead, and looked back at his family with a warm, triumphant smile that showed no trace of fear. Standing among the shattered rocks under the violet Valen sky, Leo knew that his unique blend of human resilience and alien energy was no longer just a survival tool, but a powerful shield dedicated to protecting the family that had given him a life. The following afternoon, the calm that usually settled over the valley was shattered by a deep, low rumble that differed completely from the natural weather patterns of Valen Prime. The ground vibrated with a sharp, artificial rhythm, causing the tools on Kalia's workshop walls to rattle violently against their iron pegs. Leo stepped out onto the wide stone courtyard beside Vale, his sharp senses immediately picking up the heavy smell of ozone and burnt metal drifting over the southern ridge. Farther down the valley, near the old basalt quarry where the children often played, a massive rockfall had triggered an unstable chain reaction, trapping a team of local Valen miners beneath hundreds of tons of crushed stone and exposed, sparking power cables. Zora and Nox sprinted up the slope toward them, reporting through heavy breaths that the regional emergency wardens were still several hours away, trapped on the far side of the mountain pass due to the seasonal squalls. Without a second thought, Kalia commanded her 4 children to grab their heavy gear, emphasizing that every minute counted if they were to clear the entrance before the crushed power lines ignited the surrounding gas pockets. As they raced down the winding mountain path toward the quarry, Leo felt a quiet, focused energy surging through his dense muscles. He knew that this would not be a mere training exercise or a short battle with a wild creature, but a true test of his strength in a real-world disaster. Arriving at the mouth of the collapsed quarry, the siblings were met with a scene of absolute chaos, with frantic miners trying in vain to clear the entrance using their light kinetic blasts. The blast had brought down an entire cliff face of heavy, dense basalt, completely blocking the main shaft with boulders as large as small houses. To make matters far worse, a high-voltage ether conduit had snapped during the initial rockfall, spitting wild, jagged arcs of blue electricity into the surrounding metal scaffolding. The sheer heat and raw voltage were keeping the regular Valen workers from getting anywhere near the rubble, as their sensitive, crystalline nervous systems were extremely vulnerable to unchanneled electrical shocks. Vale immediately took charge of the perimeter, organizing the surrounding workers and using his controlled energy shields to prevent smaller loose rocks from tumbling down onto the rescue area. Zora used her precise, needle-thin light beams to slice through the smaller metallic debris, creating a clear pathway toward the main blockage. However, when the miners tried to approach the central wall of fallen stone, a massive wave of raw, wild electricity erupted from the severed conduit, driving them back with painful burns. One of the senior miners shouted in despair, declaring that no one could get close enough to lift the heavy central rocks without being instantly overwhelmed by the high-voltage discharge. Leo stepped past the retreating workers, his heavy boots crushing the gravel beneath his feet as he unbuckled his outer protective leather coat. He turned to Knox, asking his younger brother to use his sensory abilities to pinpoint the exact location of the trapped miners behind the wall. Knox closed his eyes, extending his delicate energy field through the cracks in the stone, and quickly confirmed that 6 miners were huddled in an air pocket directly behind the central, 5-ton basalt block. Leo nodded firmly, cracking his neck from side to side, and walked straight toward the crackling, electric zone that had driven all the other Valen workers away in terror. As soon as Leo stepped into the electrical perimeter, violent arcs of blue energy leapt from the severed cable, striking his broad chest and arms with the force of continuous lightning bolts. The surrounding miners gasped, expecting the young man to be instantly vaporized or paralyzed by the sheer voltage. Instead, Leo let out a long, steady breath, opening his internal energy channels to receive the onslaught. His high-density human muscle tissue and compressed bone structure acted as a perfect grounded conductor, absorbing the massive electrical charge instantly. Rather than burning his skin, the wild electricity turned his entire frame into a brilliant, glowing beacon of golden light that illuminated the dark quarry entrance. Fueled by the immense thermal and kinetic power surging through his veins, Leo planted his boots into the fractured ground, wedged his calloused hands under the bottom edge of the 5-ton basalt boulder, and locked his arms. He gave a massive, body-rattling heave, his dense leg muscles bulging against the extreme weight as he forced his way upward. With a deafening roar that echoed off the high canyon walls, Leo lifted the massive stone block completely off the ground, holding it above his head while the violent electricity continued to discharge harmlessly across his golden skin. The miners stared in absolute, speechless shock, unable to comprehend how a youth with no crystalline traits could possess such godlike physical strength. Zora and Knox moved in instantly behind him, using their nimble lightness and energy fields to clear out the smaller debris and pull the 6 terrified miners out of the dark shaft to safety. Once the last miner was pulled into the clear air, Leo turned and hurled the massive boulder 20 feet away into an empty ravine, where it shattered into harmless dust upon impact. As the golden glow slowly receded from his skin, Leo wiped a mixture of sweat and black soot from his face, turning to check on the rescued workers. The senior miner stepped forward, his trembling hands reaching out to touch Leo's solid arm, asking with deep reverence what kind of hero had just saved their lives. Leo looked back at Vale, Zora, and Knox, who were standing nearby with wide, proud smiles on their faces, feeling an overwhelming warmth in his heart that had nothing to do with absorbed electricity. He looked the old miner in the eye, replying calmly that he wasn't a hero from some distant story, but simply a son of the valley who looked after his family and neighbors. By the time the regional wardens finally arrived at the quarry hours later, the rescue was completely finished, and the story of the heavy, golden youth who had held up a mountain was already spreading through the crowd like wildfire. Walking back up the mountain trail toward their home as the evening sun set the sky ablaze, Vale wrapped an arm around Leo's broad shoulders, chuckling softly as he remarked that their secret life on the dunes was probably over for good. Leo laughed, his deep voice carrying comfortably over the quiet wind, stating that he didn't care if the whole planet knew who he was now. He held his head high as they reached the threshold of their homestead, where Kalia stood waiting for them with open arms, knowing that no matter what changes came to their world tomorrow, he had proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that he truly belonged to the heavy earth beneath his feet. The aftermath of the quarry rescue brought an undeniable shift to the quiet life the family had maintained for 16 years. Word of the extraordinary, golden-skinned youth who had lifted a 5-ton boulder and absorbed high-voltage ether currents reached the regional capital within days. It was not long before a high-ranking warden vessel descended from the violet sky, its sleek, pearl-colored hull landing silently on the blue dunes outside Kalia's homestead. 2 tall, distinguished officials stepped out, their skin shimmering with deep indigo light that marked them as senior planetary administrators. Kalia stood at her front door, her posture tall and resolute, with Vale, Zora, Nox, and Leo standing firmly by her side. The lead administrator stepped forward, holding a metallic scanning device that flickered as it processed Leo's unique anatomical signatures. The official looked up from the screen, his dark eyes wide with quiet amazement as he addressed Kalia, noting that the biological readings confirmed Leo was human, originating from a star system thousands of light-years away. He explained that according to planetary isolation protocols, off-world survivors were usually placed under official care in a specialized sanctuary. However, he quickly added that the reports from the miners, combined with the obvious physical bond between Leo and his family, presented a situation that no standard protocol had ever anticipated. The administrator looked directly at Leo, offering him a small, polished data crystal that contained the decoded star charts from his long-lost escape pod. He explained that the crystal held the coordinates of active human colonies across the outer rim, offering to arrange safe transport if Leo wished to seek out his own biological species. Silence settled over the courtyard as Kalia, Vale, Zora, and Nox looked at Leo, their faces filled with unconditional support, ready to accept whatever choice he made for his future. Leo stepped forward, taking the cool data crystal into his thick, calloused palm, staring at the faint holographic map of distant human stars floating above his hand. He looked at the strange, sharp constellations of his birth world, then turned his gaze toward the family that had raised him under Valen Prime's crushing sky. He remembered his childhood struggles, the long hours spent dragging iron weights up the blue dunes, the warmth of his mother's forge, and the boundless love of siblings who had treated his differences not as a flaw, but as a unique strength. He looked his mother in the eye and handed the crystal back to the administrator, declaring calmly and firmly that his story had not been written among those distant stars, but right here in the blue sand of this valley. He affirmed that while his blood might be human, his heart, his home, and his family belonged to this world. The administrator looked at the young man for a long moment, a slow, respectful smile spreading across his face as he closed the data device. He agreed that a youth who could absorb the planet's wildest energy and hold up its mountains had earned his place on Valen Prime far more than most who were born beneath its sky. He formally registered Leo as a full citizen of the valley, granting the family total protection under planetary law, before turning and boarding his vessel, leaving the homestead in peaceful quiet once more. As the ship vanished into the violet clouds above, Zora let out a loud, joyous laugh, hovering into the air and throwing her arms around Leo's broad neck in a tight embrace. Later that evening, as the twin suns sank below the horizon, painting the ether veins overhead in brilliant shades of gold and deep crimson, Kalia prepared a massive celebratory feast inside the hearthroom. She brought out the old, gray synthetic cloth from 16 years ago, the very fabric that had kept Leo warm when he was just a helpless infant in the dust dunes. She carefully draped it over his broad shoulders like a mantle, smiling through tears of pride as she told him that he had grown into the finest son a mother could ever ask for. She remarked how amazing it was that a child wrapped in such a small, fragile cloth had grown to become the strongest pillar of their home. Vale raised a goblet of sweet, sparkling root juice, offering a toast to his brother, declaring that no matter how high he or Zora could fly into the sky, they would always be proud to stand in the shadow of the mountain Leo had built. Nox walked over and bumped his shoulder against Leo's, smiling softly as he reminded his brother that the foundation of their family was now unshakable. Leo looked around the warm, glowing room at the smiling faces of his mother and siblings, feeling a deep, overwhelming sense of gratitude for the strange, wonderful destiny that had dropped his pod into the blue sand so many years ago. He pulled his mother, brother, and sisters into a massive, warm group hug, his broad arms wrapping securely around all of them as their faint blue luminescence mingled with the warm, golden glow radiating softly from his own skin. They laughed and celebrated deep into the night, their voices echoing comfortably across the quiet dunes under the glittering alien stars. Leo looked up through the open courtyard skylight at the vast, endless sky above, no longer feeling like a stranger stranded far from home, but fully content in the knowledge that he was exactly where he was meant to be, a child of heavy stars, surrounded by the unstoppable force of a family's love.